something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. This is a very special episode in that it features Professor Jeffrey Sachs interviewing me for his excellent podcast and video series, Book Club with Jeffrey Sachs. This is a great series in which Professor Sachs interviews authors of important new books. Says Professor Sachs about the series, their stories about justice, their stories about rationality and irrationality. They're stories about cruelty and heroism. They're stories that tell us about our past so that we have a better way forward, a way forward to the future we want. I encourage everyone to follow Book Club with Jeffrey Sachs. The professor is a great interviewer, and his choices of books and authors are excellent. They have a YouTube channel, and they are on all the major podcasting apps. The official website is bookclubwithjeffreysachs.org. I also want to take a moment to thank a previous guest on Book Club with Jeffrey Sachs, Monica Wiesack, author of the excellent book, America's Last President, What the World Lost When It Lost John F. Kennedy. I also interviewed her about this book on the American Exception podcast, for what it's worth. Monica put me in touch with Professor Sachs, which is something I'd been hoping for because I kept hearing Jeffrey Sachs in interviews and articles making statements that were more and more in alignment with my main theses in American Exception, Empire, and the Deep State. So again, big thanks to Monica Wiesack for her part in this. Devil's Chess Club is part of the American Exception podcast. We are only able to do this work because of our paying subscribers. The tech monopoly platforms are not our friends. If you want to access this illuminating analysis of deep politics and forensic history, please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. We just kicked off our new Gray Alliance series, which covers the extremely important institutionalized relationship between the U.S. national security state and organized crime. Independent researcher Max Arvo and I are tracing the evolution and consolidation of this Gray Alliance, as Peter Dale Scott has termed it. American organized crime has played essential roles for the U.S. empire and for the oligarchs who own the U.S. empire. We'll be looking at the Lansky Syndicate, Jimmy Hoffa's Teamsters, Jack Ruby, the CIA's global drug connection, the JFK assassination, Watergate, and the Gray Alliance elements which link all these things. This is not Illuminati globalist silliness. It's new and deadly serious material that you cannot find anywhere else. So if you want to understand the way that the U.S. empire works, here at the twilight of Western imperialism, and specifically how the Gray Alliance played a crucial role in making the U.S. into the corrupt, lawless, dying empire that we see today, please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. Jeffrey Sachs is a world-renowned economics professor, best-selling author, innovative educator, and global leader in sustainable development. He's widely recognized for bold and effective strategies to address complex challenges, including debt crises, hyperinflations, the transition from central planning to market economies, the control of AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, the escape from extreme poverty, and the battle against human-induced climate change. Sachs serves as the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, where he holds the rank of university professor, the university's highest academic rank. Sachs held the position of director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University from 2002 to 2016. He is president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, a commissioner for the UN Broadband Commission for Development, and an SDG advocate for UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. From 2001 to 2018, Sachs served as special advisor to UN Secretaries General Kofi Annan, Ban Ki-moon, and Antonio Guterres. Sachs has authored and edited numerous books, including 3 New York Times bestsellers, The End of Poverty, Commonwealth, Economics for a Crowded Planet, and The Price of Civilization. Other books include To Move the World, JFK's Quest for Peace, and A New Foreign Policy, Beyond American Exceptionalism, and most recently, The Ages of Globalization, Geography, Technology, and Institutions. Sachs was the co-recipient of the 2015 Blue Planet Prize, the leading global prize for environmental leadership. He was twice named among Time magazine's 100 most influential world leaders and has received 32 honorary doctorate degrees. The New York Times called Sachs probably the most important economist in the world, and Time magazine called Sachs the world's best-known economist. A survey by The Economist magazine ranked Sachs as among the 3 most influential living economists. A native of Detroit, Michigan, Sachs, before joining Columbia, spent over 20 years as a professor at Harvard University, where he had received his BA, MA, and PhD degrees. By contrast, I began my undergraduate career at the University of Southern Indiana. All that biographical material, except for the last bit there, is from the Columbia University website. I now want to read an article that I wrote about Jeffrey Sachs that a previous employer chose not to publish. So I'm going to read this because I think it's a good preface and an introduction for Sachs for people who are not familiar with his background. A rare voice of reason, Professor Jeffrey Sachs confronts the U.S. establishment. Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University is virtually a lone voice of sanity in the U.S. establishment. With the word establishment, I'm referring to the persons who either exert political power through their positions within prestigious mainstream institutions, or people whose money and power allow them to have outsized influence over politics, culture, and society. Among those ensconced in various university think tank or media posts and sinecures, Sachs stands virtually alone in confronting the tragic excesses of the U.S. empire and the entrenched interests which determine U.S. behavior across presidential administrations. He's also been one of the very few public intellectuals with the courage to break with America's corrupt two-party system. Like many critics of U.S. imperialism, my first encounter with Sachs depicted him as a neoliberal technocrat, an advisor hired by Russia in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse. Sachs was castigated by people like Naomi Klein for his involvement in the shock therapy reforms imposed by the West on Russia. Having heard and read his explanation of these events, I am now somewhat sympathetic to Sachs. He claims that he wanted the West to provide financial relief for Russia rather than forcing the country to sell off its assets at fire sale prices, a policy that had catastrophic consequences. Sachs recommended policies like those which allowed Poland to restructure its economy with much better results. According to Sachs, the different approaches stemmed from the fact that U.S. elites wanted draconian measures imposed on Russia for geopolitical reasons. He claims, plausibly, that this was the reason for his 1994 resignation. Throughout the 21st century, as U.S. foreign policy has gone further and further off the rails, Sachs has been a sensible voice. In the spring of 2003, he wrote about the Iraq War, stating, "Bush and Blair have failed to make the case to the world, with the partial exception of their own countries. The American people have been treated to a spectacle of jingoism, fear-mongering, confusion of Iraq with Osama bin Laden's terrorists, and simple patriotism. None of this swayed the rest of the world, which views the war with disdain and alarm." Considering the possibility that President Bush's WMD case would be borne out, Sachs argued that, even in those circumstances, war might well have been unwise compared to a policy of containment. He was also a rare voice of reason when the U.S. toppled Haiti's elected government in 2004. In an LA Times op-ed entitled "From His First Day in Office, Bush Was Ousting Aristide," Sachs pointed out that the U.S. has repeatedly sponsored coups and uprisings in Haiti and in neighboring Caribbean countries. In the article, Sachs explains that prior to the 2004 coup, the most recent such episode in Haiti came in 1991 during the first Bush administration, when thugs on the CIA payroll were among the leaders of paramilitary groups that toppled Aristide after his 1990 election. Professor Jeffrey Sachs was also one of the only figures, if not the only figure, to speak honestly about the horrific reality of the Syrian dirty war. On MSNBC's Morning Joe, he apparently shocked the hosts by speaking honestly about the conflict in precisely the opposite way that corporate media outlets had been covering the war. Said Sachs, "This Syrian civil war happened because of the United States. These 600,000 dead are not just incidental. The United States started a war to overthrow a regime. It was covert. It was Operation Timber Sycamore. People can look it up, the CIA operation. Together with Saudi Arabia, still shrouded in secrecy, a major war effort shrouded in secrecy, never debated by Congress, never explained to the American people, signed by President Obama, never explained." Sachs even spoke about the heart of the problem, the, quote, permanent state, the CIA, the Pentagon. On Ukraine, he was also very prescient. In 2014, Sachs stated that the U.S. has aggressively tried to expand NATO right up to Russian borders, inviting both Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. He added that such a move was, quote, simply dangerous, wrong-headed, and provocative. More recently, Sachs wrote an article for the Kennedy Beacon in which he lays out the real history of the war in Ukraine. Professor Sachs has managed to do a very difficult and unusual thing. He has pointed out the dark void at the pinnacle of power in the U.S., but in a cautious and scholarly way. This is perhaps most clear in his treatment of the John F. Kennedy administration. In his book, To Move the World, JFK's Quest for Peace, Sachs chronicles how Kennedy tried to move the U.S. away from the disastrous imperialism of the Cold War. Professor Sachs even has the courage to address the taboo subject of the JFK assassination. He told Chris Hedges of the Real News Network, back then anyway, that he is personally convinced that CIA figures like Allen Dulles killed JFK after having studied this in depth for decades. He explained his understanding of the assassination and its relevance to our current situation. Quote, "I'm pretty convinced that it was rogue elements within the U.S. government itself. We don't know exactly who, but this was a conspiracy, and it was a conspiracy against peace. And our security state is in full force. Our current president, in my view, is not in control, and in any event, has been a hardliner and a Cold Warrior, whatever you want to call it, well past the Cold War. These neocons don't understand peace, they don't understand negotiation, they don't understand diplomacy, they don't understand the nuclear threat." On the crucial issue of biowarfare, Sachs again confronted the crackpot groupthink of the U.S. establishment. He chaired the Commission on COVID Origins for the world's top medical journal, The Lancet. His conclusion is that the virus came out of the U.S. lab biotechnology, not out of nature. So it's a blunder, in my view, of biotech, not an accident of a natural spillover. Just as with Syria and Ukraine, we keep receiving more confirmation that Sachs is right and the establishment, or the corporate mainstream, whatever we want to call it, is wrong. Perhaps most importantly, cooperative internationalism is a major aspect of Jeffrey Sachs' scholarship and political activities in recent years. On November 20, 2023, he appeared in front of the United Nations Security Council to speak about how the UN could go a long way toward establishing world peace by acting cooperatively to end 4 major ongoing conflicts: the Ukraine War, the post-1967 Israel-Palestine War, the Syrian War, and the Sahel Wars in West Africa. At a moment when gloom abounds among the Western intelligentsia, Sachs offered some much-needed optimism. He closed his comments to the Security Council by reiterating his optimism about the constructive role that the United Nations could play in the world, stating, "I believe firmly in the capacity of the United Nations and of this Security Council to keep the peace and to promote sustainable development." He also affirmed the importance of international law. When all 193 UN member states live up to the UN Charter, we will have a new global age of peace and sustainable development. So that was my take on Jeffrey Sachs, written before I had had any contact with him. I do have deep respect for Sachs because he is such a rare figure right now, an extremely intelligent scholar who received as much establishment acclaim as any academic can, and who nevertheless has grown to see and publicly expound on the fact that this same U.S. establishment is so duplicitous, lawless, greedy, and aggressively imperialist as to threaten the existence of human civilization, if not the species. This may sound self-serving, but just the fact that he would give me a platform to discuss my book is noteworthy. The dissertation was a broadside aimed at the pinnacle of American power and at the historians and social scientists who construct the obscurantist theories and narratives which stupefy and confound any real sense-making in the West. The fact that we had this conversation is very heartening to me. So now, having given that introduction, here is my discussion of American Exception, Empire, and the Deep State on Book Club with Jeffrey Sachs.
Welcome to Book Club with Jeffrey Sachs. Today, I'm absolutely delighted and very excited to have with me as guest and author Aaron Good to talk about his remarkable book, this one, American Exception, Empire, and the Deep State. Aaron, thank you for joining. Aaron, let me just introduce to everybody, is a fairly newly minted PhD in political science. Indeed, American Exception is produced from a remarkable PhD dissertation in 2020 at Temple University. Aaron is a political scientist and a very well-known podcaster with his podcast, American Exception. So you're often on the other side of the interview line, but I'm thrilled to be able to talk about your book because I find it very, very illuminating, extremely well done, and very important to try to figure out what's going on in our world today. So, Aaron, thank you so much for being together with me today.
Well, it's my pleasure, and it's an honor to be talking with you about my book and the subject matter of the book. It seems all timely with the state of the U.S. at the moment, and I'm really looking forward to this.
Great. Well, Aaron, your book is about who runs U.S. foreign policy and for what purpose is U.S. foreign policy run. It's a question I've been trying to understand and figure out my whole career, which is a little bit longer than yours because I've been a minted PhD. I can't say newly minted. That happened 44 years ago. And I became an economist, both an academic and a practitioner. And when you're practicing economics in the world, meaning you're trying to figure out what to do to help an economy and so forth, inevitably you come up against the United States government, and which calls a lot of the shots in the world. So you always are, as I have been for 40 years, facing the U.S., whether it's in the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or directly U.S. policy. And I was pretty naive when I started. Absolutely. I thought, well, I'm proud to be an American. I'm an American economist. I'm out helping countries in the world. And the U.S. government has my back. This is because the U.S. is for good and it does good things in the world. And it supports good causes and so on. So I come at this starting as an innocent, I have to say, not completely. Of course, I was against the Vietnam War. I lived through as a young boy Kennedy's assassination. My first political love was Robert F. Kennedy, who, of course, was assassinated in 1968. So I wouldn't say a complete innocent, but for 44 years, I've come to have grave doubts, more than doubts. In other words, I've come to regard what the U.S. does in the world as a great danger to the world. And you write about that and help illuminate that in a very deep way. And you call the book American Exception, and your theory is exceptionism. So maybe a good place to start would be to explain what is it that you mean by American exceptionism? What does it mean in practice about foreign policy? And then I want to get into the heart of the matter. Who is running the show and for what reasons? Because you have a very elaborate explanation that I think is very persuasive and important, and I want the people to hear from you about that. So, what is exceptionism?
Well, it calls to mind, of course, American exceptionalism, which is the guiding mythology of U.S. global dominance, which is the U.S. is this special country that can do what that is better than other countries. It doesn't have the corruption and other problems of countries that came before the U.S. became the leader of the free world. And it's a strange mythology if you start to break it down. But American exception looks at it at a different way, or the idea of exceptionism. It looks at Carl Schmitt, the German, Nazi legal theorist, essentially, and his arguments about what to do, what a liberal democracy can do in the state of in a state of crisis, where the state faces an existential threat. For Germany at the time of Carl Schmitt, it was a communist revolution in the aftermath of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. And he argues that the state will have the power, the state must have the power to defend itself when faced with a very serious, grave threat. And it's a state of emergency that is so important that when it comes down to it, whoever has the power in a state to say when the state of emergency exists is really sovereign. He is sovereign who decides on the exception. That's his dictum or quote that he's most famous for. And this is something that liberal democracy doesn't quite deal with really well in the United States. We're based on the theories of John Locke and his classical liberalism ideas of property rights and Republican institutions. But even he says
government by consent. The idea that who's in charge, if you ask the question, well, we're taught in civics class, the American people are in charge, of course.
Precisely. And so this is the basis of liberalism. But as I pointed out in my book, in which other people, based on some of the research of other people as well, and other theorists, this, even under John Locke, he mentions the possibility of, well, what if the executive is acting in a despotic way? I mean, the executive needs to be able to intervene to save the system if need be. But what if somebody abuses this power to act, above the law in a time of an emergency? And he essentially comes down to the conclusion that if that happens, if you have someone who abuses the state of exception, he doesn't call it that, but that's what he's talking about. If you have an abusive authority, then only a revolution is there to help you. And we have been ruled by a regime that has institutionalized this dynamic, this power, this prerogative power, to break the law and to basically break every law under the sun. The innovation of the U.S. compared to the Mongols or other empires is that they really refine covert operations. And so the lawlessness is typically denied. They just break whatever laws, overthrow governments, assassinate people.
See, we don't I think this is a starting point also. Maybe listeners abroad, because Book Club has a worldwide participation, but Americans are certainly not brought up to think that we have a government that breaks the law, even is institutionalized, as you say, to break the law. In other words, it's a routine part of American foreign policy to break the law.
Yeah,
not just foreign policy, because you talk about domestic policy also.
Yes, domestic policy on the most fundamental level. The Constitution of the United States, the Supremacy Clause, establishes that ratified treaties are the highest law in the land. The United States has ratified the UN Charter, and therefore it is, according to the Constitution, the highest law in the land. And we violate it all the time. I mean, they come up with different almost comical legalistic arguments as to why this is okay, but it's fundamentally just unconstitutional.
It's interesting you use the example because I work with and for the UN and have done so for the last 24 years. And I have never, ever heard a single U.S. official, I think it's fair to say ever, heard a single U.S. official say, well, we'd like to do this, but we can't because of the UN Charter. The whole idea that an American official would say, well, we're bound by the treaty of the UN Charter is almost unimaginable for me and sad, of course, but also deeply ironic because the UN is, in my view, one of the great accomplishments of who I regard as America's greatest president. I don't hold most of them in very high repute, but Franklin Roosevelt. But in any event, we don't take pride in the UN in terms of actually enforcing the UN Charter. We ignore it completely.
And don't acknowledge that that's what we do. It's a legal argument that you don't need to have taken any pre-law course to understand. It's if you are literate, you can understand why we're actually forbidden from launching all these wars and overthrowing these governments. It's illegal to even threaten aggression against other countries. There are no consequences for it whatsoever. And the fact that is taken out of the conversation is very fundamental to why. I mean, I've followed your career and I understand the trajectory of your career. As you were saying, it took you a while to understand political, the some of these aspects of the U.S. empire. And I understand that because these civilizations and empires create their own cosmology, and people cannot but absorb these dominant ideas. And if you're going to be successful, the more successful you are, and you were very successful, the more you kind of successfully internalize those ideas, typically.
For me, it was very interesting. Of course, I had, as I said, the Vietnam War era skepticism, Watergate skepticism, and I learned about Watergate from you also. So I want to talk a little bit about that later on. But I was a skeptic. But on the other hand, I viewed U.S. bad behavior abroad as mistakes or errors or deviations, maybe not even from the norm, but just as deviations that were correctable. And I had in my own life experience, I started as an economic advisor abroad in the mid-1980s in Latin America, and I was very unhappy with how the U.S. was handling the debt crisis. And I knew there were powerful interests, U.S. banking interests, so I wasn't completely naive, in la-la land. But I thought, this is solvable. And in a particular case or two, I actually solved the problem. And then in the late 1980s, I worked with Poland, and the U.S. government more or less did what I recommended. So I thought, it's not completely off the tracks. Then I advised the Soviet government under Gorbachev briefly, and then the Russian government and Ukrainian governments, by the way, at the same time in the early 1990s. And then I started to say, whoa, this is weird. They don't want to do even the most, U.S. that is, doesn't want to do even the most basic things to help these two countries. And then that was really, for me, a puzzle. I have to say, this is, where my innocence came in. Why isn't the U.S. helping Russia, which wants to be a democratic country? It's post-communist. We used to say communism was the enemy. But there's no communism anymore. They want just the opposite. But the U.S. won't take the most minimal steps to help this country. So that was part of my journey. But your point is, there's an underlying continuity to what the U.S. is trying to do, and it wouldn't, given your research, it wouldn't surprise you or have surprised you based on your understanding in 1991 why the U.S. would say, "Oh no, we're not going to help them."
Well, I followed these events as a kid, because my mother worked for a congressman in Indiana, and so I was there through the end of the at the end of the Cold War. I was like in junior high or something like that, and when it happened, it seemed like, oh, this is a good thing. And I even though I grew my earliest political memories of Ronald Reagan and Iran Contra, so I it's a different experience in a sense. It wasn't that difficult for me to become fairly radical, um, but I did in part because I didn't, after college, I went to teach abroad for a year, and there was a lot of anti-Americanism among people that were over there around 2000. And I come back and 9/11 happens, and I never watched the footage on 9/11. And I'm not that I'm squeamish about it. I just thought I don't want to see this because it just sounds pretty terrible, and I'll read about it later. But then all these flags come up, and it's kind of insane to me at the time because I didn't watch the event. I think it was a psychologically searing event for people that I really missed out on because for whatever reason I was kind of didn't have a big plan for life and had just returned from being overseas for a year, and I didn't follow it. So it didn't really impact me in the same way, except I read about it. But the Bush administration seemed so criminal to me that it seemed to be blatantly criminal what they did with Iraq. And I thought Obama would change it. I worked for Obama and on his campaign staff, and I went to the inaugural ball and everything. And then he basically said, "We're going to look forward, not backward," which is, as a legal constitutional scholar, is an insane. I mean, you could apply that argument to Ted Bundy or something. I mean, imagine if Eichmann said that. It would, or it's just insanity.
Yeah, this is fascinating. By the way, the night that Obama got elected, my wife and I were in tears. We cried. We were so happy. I have to say, our kids who were early Obama boosters already by late summer of 2008, before the election, said, one of our daughters said, "Dad, something's wrong. Something's wrong. This is not what it looks like on the surface." And indeed, he turned out to be a warmongering Nobel Peace Prize laureate, who got a Peace Prize for nothing, and then launched many wars. And this raises the fundamental question. And so let's go back to the beginning. Who runs American foreign policy? And your experience with Obama as having been on the campaign, even in the inaugural gala as president, is my sense of this question. Every president of my, there's Reagan, and that's Reagan and Bush. That's the 1980s. Starting with Clinton at the end of the Cold War. Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden. You would have said before each one came to office, this is going to be a big change. And not one of them changed anything in the general direction of American foreign policy, which continued to be a policy of war and regime change abroad. So it's Democrats and Republicans, so-called internationalists or nationalists, so-called liberals or conservatives. Even with Obama, we thought an idealist, constitutional lawyer. I would argue, and I think your book makes the point, and you argue, I don't want to put words in your mouth, that not one of them changed course. It didn't matter who was elected. They all basically did the same thing. Is that right?
I have come to have a little, as strange as this sounds, because my book ends, and I want to write a sequel to it eventually that picks up where this one ends, because I think the Reagan presidency, it ends with the Reagan Revolution, which I see as the ultimate victory of kind of the forces that drive the deep state. Essentially, there were no real liberal internationalists like Kennedy in any part of the political spectrum anymore that were close to power. However, Reagan and Bush the first had, I think they had different ideas about neoconservatism. Then I think that they tried to accommodate a lot of the neoconservative forces, but they also tried to dial some of them back in the national interest. Reagan, one of the last things that Reagan did was to recognize the Palestinian Liberation Organization after they had renounced terrorism. And he does this right at the very end of his presidency.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
What kind
I
of...
hadn't picked that up. That's interesting.
And and the main person I associate with that, the neoconservative policy, Bibi Netanyahu, his most, I think, significant emissary in the United States is the Prince of Darkness, Richard Pearl, right?
Yeah.
And he ends up being the person that somehow is able to overrule, George Shultz and these other people at Reykjavik over the nuclear issue. And that's strange. And then, he's working later for during the H.W. Bush administration. These people are behind that Pentagon policy planning document. And Bush says, send this back to the crazies at the Pentagon. George H.W. Bush also attempts to force the Palestinians or the Israelis to organize, to negotiate with the Palestinians. He says,
we're going to interject a couple things for listeners. You mentioned Reykjavik, which was the summit of Reagan and Gorbachev in 1986, I believe.
Yes.
And the leaders wanted to end nuclear weapons, and their aides were aghast. Are you crazy? You can't do that. But, they wanted actually to do something very, very ambitious and forward and peacemaking. But the deep state came in and said, oh, no, that's not how it works. You can't do that.
Yeah.
And so you're pointing out, and this is one of these questions, what do presidents have to do with any of this? Because they're told what to do. And not by the American people.
Right. And the neoconservative takeover of U.S. foreign policy, which I think that George H.W. Bush, for example, represented some pretty nefarious old boy CIA types, like the people that I imagine were largely responsible for the killing of the Kennedy brothers. However, the neoconservatives represented something worse. They were more fanatical.
Yeah. Remember that Bush Sr. was CIA director before he became president. And you and I agreed that the CIA was part of a coup in 1963 that assassinated and overthrew the U.S. government. And there was Bush as president. But you're saying that's not the worst of what happened, because I think you're getting to the point that after Reagan and Bush Sr., with the arrival of Bill Clinton, who I would have said politically 32 years ago, well, I'm one of that side, or he's one of us. But something happened afterwards, yes?
I have no idea exactly why Bill Clinton ended up sort of pursuing hardline neocon policies in a way but it didn't come across that way at the time. But now it seems more clear. Not just the Yugoslavia business, which actually is kind of, the Kosovo War is like the precursor to the Iraq War in terms of ultimately being pretty criminal, and you don't have to make that hard of an argument for that.
And just to remind everybody, 1999, the U.S. led NATO bombed Belgrade 78 straight days, bombed a European capital. NATO, this is no UN justification. And why? To break Serbia in parts and to create, we're supposed to hold borders sacrosanct. That's what we hear all the time. But the whole idea was the U.S. would bomb Serbia into letting go or breaking apart Kosovo. And what happens with Kosovo, by the way, quite fascinating. It becomes home to the largest U.S. military base in Southeast Europe. They break apart a country and then they put a huge military base there. Well, surprise, that's Bill Clinton.
Right. And it's also a kind of narcotics trafficking epicenter as well. I mean, it's run by essentially a mafia. I mean, the Kosovo Liberation Army was involved in organ trafficking, arms smuggling, drug smuggling, every crime under the sun. And we just made a little principality out of it and I think it was KBR that got that huge contract to create that Camp Bondsteel, which can be seen from outer space. I mean, it's really, and Bill Clinton pursued other policies as well with these sort of jihadi networks in places like Chechnya, Azerbaijan. That was really probably under Bush, but it continued. There's this clandestine foreign policy of using Al-Qaeda types. The Brits at one point tried to use Al-Qaeda to assassinate Gaddafi in the late 90s.
And then they did assassinate Gaddafi by 2011.
Yes, and it's a really neoconservative agenda for global dominance. That's the shift that takes place. You see it starting to surface immediately under H.W. Bush. Something that's even more fanatical than the Reagan, Council on Foreign Relations, Wall Street empire plan for the world is this neoconservative plan. And that has shifted the U.S. into being so aggressive that it's actually undoing all the work of people in the past. And it's making people like George H.W. Bush, who I would consider, or George H.W. Bush, I consider him pretty villainous by and large. And yet he seems like a wise statesman because he seemed to understand that you had to rationally manage the empire. You had to have some sense of predicting cause and effect. You couldn't be guided by eschatological imperatives. At least that's what I would say now when I think about his thought process. Because
isn't it something that that's exactly my trajectory. You go back and you look at Nixon, Reagan, Bush. Whoa, they were moderates compared to what we have with Clinton or Obama or Biden.
Yes, it's really something, because I do think that Reagan, you can trace his career and what he did in the 60s and so on, and it's not very hard to make a case against Reagan, and I do, and I would anytime, but these people that have come after, and it's something, it can't be blamed on the individuals. It must be that the regime and the system itself has changed and become more hard line about certain aspects, because Obama actually seems, as bad as Obama was, he seemed to try to moderate some of these things. You've talked about what he did in Syria, which was horrible, and he spent billions on it, but ultimately he pulled back from the abyss, which to me says he knew that it was probably a bad idea all along. Skyhorse wrote about it in the New Yorker in 2007 as a plot they were hatching to use jihadi types to destabilize Syria. But Obama aids and abets that, approves that covert operation, but then he finally says, well, it's not a slam dunk, or that's what his CIA director says about these chemical weapons attacks, and he doesn't invade. At least there's that, or at least the invasion is a small thing.
That's
later.
Very interesting. I think that's a good characterization of Obama. Again, you campaigned for him. I certainly voted and supported him, knew him, in his presidency. But he definitely ceded the territory in the end to the neocons and to the imperialists in Washington. And we'll come to who those are in a moment, I hope. But he did have a little bit, he did more than that. He had some break. He did a lot of acceleration, a lot of damage in Syria, in Libya, in Ukraine, because it was in the Obama administration that the U.S. participated in the coup in February 2014 that overthrew the Ukrainian government that started this war that we're in right now. So that was under Obama. But he did three things that we could say put the brakes on to his own mischief. One was he didn't go all the way in Syria after having started the overthrow. He didn't go full force into Syria. He held back a bit, but still it's been an incredibly disastrous period, which I blame the United States for entirely in this case. In the case of Iran, of course, he negotiated the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan with Iran for denuclearization of Iran, and then Trump abandoned that, and Biden did not return to it. And after instigating a coup in Ukraine, which was a disaster, he at least seemed to know, well, let's not escalate. Russia will escalate on top of anything we do. And it was Biden more than anybody who took us into a complete disaster for Ukraine, 600,000 dead on Biden's watch of Ukrainians, because Biden kept escalating with the losing hand. So Obama, at least I agree, gets, I don't know whether it's C- or D, but he doesn't fail like the others.
I think that if you look at the trajectory of these presidents and how much more brazen they are, the general regime is. I mean, Obama said to people when they talked about prosecuting Bush officials for torture and such, he said, "Well, I'm worried if we do that, they'll overthrow me in a coup." So you get the sense that Obama's trying to accommodate these forces, and it seems to take a lot to accommodate them. You have to do some pretty crazy things, or else they will be, who knows what they will do. I mean, I don't know how much that entered into his thoughts, but the fact that he ever said that in the first place about the prosecution of Bush officials for pretty obvious crimes, that to me says that he understands that there's this control there and that you're really limited in what you can do. Because also the fact he pulls back from these policies ultimately, to me, says he probably understood that they were reckless from the beginning. Because he's smart, and all those things were kind of apparent. Those other drawbacks to these policies. So for moral cowardice, he's pretty terrible. And then he leaves office, and he could tell the truth about some of these things, and he really doesn't. He's there to make sure Bernie Sanders doesn't get elected, and to bring the NBA players back. He just comes in and intervenes for the establishment at the drop of a hat, and he has all the money in the world. I just I don't have much respect for for him at this point.
Aaron, I want to read to you, I think, a very interesting statement by Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, and then use that as a segue to your discussion and structuring of the tripartite state, which is how you explain how U.S. foreign policy is really made. And it's a very, very important set of ideas. But let's start with Putin, because I thought it was a kind of brilliant remark. This is President Putin in an interview to the French newspaper Le Figaro on the 29th of May, 2017. He says, I quote, "I have already spoken to 3 U.S. presidents. They come and go, but politics stay the same all the time. Do you know why? Because of the powerful bureaucracy. When a person is elected, they may have some ideas. Then people with briefcases arrive, well-dressed, wearing dark suits, just like mine, except for the red tie, since they wear black or dark blue ones. These people start explaining how things are done, and instantly everything changes. This is what happens with every administration." I found it hilarious. But basically, Putin says, my experience is I could talk to a U.S. president in the morning, get some kind of agreement, but by the afternoon, the president explains to me, no, that's not how things work. So somebody has gotten to the president, the people in dark suits and blue or black ties. Now, you present in the book in a very detailed way. It's, I'd say, the core of the dissertation, both in your literal sense of PhD dissertation and the dissertation of the book, that America is not what it looks like on the surface, what we learn in civics or what we read in the Constitution. And I think you call it the Madisonite state. That is the government that we think we have when we elect officials and they have the Constitution. But in fact, we have a tripartite state, a 3-part state. So I'd love for you to explain what are the 3 parts, how do they work, how do they relate to the goals of American foreign policy?
Well, I talk about the tripartite state, which builds upon the ideas of a dual state, and the dual state argument came from a German who came to the United States, Ernst Fraenkel, and he was describing how the Nazi state had emerged, that There was this normative state, which was the government as it ran, with certain policies for how things would be run and so on. But then eventually, in a moment of crisis, this prerogative state emerges, and it's supposed to protect the regular state, the normative state, but it ends up being, taking on a life of its own because it's omnipotent essentially, and it's this dark force of top-down control. And people have tried to adapt that to other governments in the West, other regimes in the West. And Turkey was the most famous example, where it turned out that a whole lot of coups and paramilitary false flag terror and other incidents and narcotics trafficking and so on were actually the work of a shadow government that could intervene and overthrow democratic governments and do basically whatever for political means. And so they had a word for it, Darren Devlet, which was the deep state. And that's where that deep state term comes from. But even before that, Peter Dale Scott, a Berkeley professor of English, but a political science PhD and a former Canadian diplomat, he wrote about the deep political system in the U.S. In the early 90s. And he was saying that if you look at the intelligence agencies and the networks of organized crime, intelligence, and different political actors and the overworld, or the richest oligarchs of private wealth in the United States, the richest people, there's a different kind of system in the U.S. that operates inside and outside of the official, channels of power. And he eventually comes to embrace the deep state idea. And I build on that work and say that you can look at this top-down sort of darkest version of power that you don't even necessarily know where it comes from, but it seems to always be connected to oligarchy and empire, ultimately.
A lot of money.
And it contradicts, and it's counterposed to the democratic state. So what you call the deep state, you could also call the oligarchic state if you wanted to, because it's kind of counterposed to that. Now, the security state, the national security state in the U.S., is something that gets created at the end of World War II. And it's supposedly to protect us against this threat of communism. But if you look back at it, you can really see that it's most useful as a tool for running the world, which the powerful oligarchs of the U.S. decided was going to be U.S. policy after World War II. They decided they would go for global dominance. And so they needed a new bureaucracy or set of bureaucracies. And they create the national security state with the Joint Chiefs. The Pentagon, the modern Pentagon emerges at that point. The Central Intelligence Agency gets created with the ability to do covert operations, which the president claims to not have understood he was signing at the time, and he may not have. It was written in a very innocent way. But the creation of that national...
Yeah, it's interesting. In 1947, the CIA is created as an intelligence agency, but then there's a clause in the National Security Act that says, and other things, basically. And the other things became the president's private army, the assassination squads, the overthrow system, and so forth. And probably the one that took out the Kennedys and many others. So it became the murder squad of the U.S. government.
Precisely. And even when the reason that I say it's not just a dual state kind of situation is that at times you see when even the national security state does not seem to be functioning in the way that we would think that it does. So the reason that I say that there is this additional deep state or oligarchic factor is that in times of political crisis, the national security state will not necessarily respond to the public state or the democratic state. This seems to have happened to, most obviously, to John F. Kennedy, but even with Richard Nixon, the way that he is trying to use the CIA he fires the CIA director and then tries to use the CIA to help him against this campaign that he believes the CIA is pretty much behind in terms of leaking all these things to the press and so on. And for good reason, he thought that. So you see Nixon being under attack from national security state type forces or forces that are behind the scenes, but he can't get to the bottom of it when he is the president. And to me, this points to something besides the national security state and besides the democratic state. It's a kind of deep oligarchic part of our regime. So you could use the term deep state.
And I think it's interesting. You use the term for that, the overlords.
Overworld.
Overworld,
Yeah.
excuse me. And overworld is the counterpart of the underworld, of course. Interesting for the security state, the underworld, that is really organized crime, has been a partner of the security state from the very beginning. In other words, the CIA was funded from drug trade, for example, starting back in Thailand in the late 1940s. So the underworld is not just a thing, the mafia and so forth. It's part of, it's a partner of the security state. But then you talk about the contrast of the underworld, the overworld, which I think is a wonderful expression, by the way. And living in New York City, you can't help but see the overworld in its various various manifestations all over this city, whether it's Wall Street or the billionaires in Midtown and so forth, uh, and the Council on Foreign Relations, of which I am a member. But when you look at the history of that organization and the role that it's played, that's the overworld organization par excellence. And by the way, thank you for pointing out the War and Peace Studies project of the Council on Foreign Relations, which I had no idea about before reading your book. But those were studies already in the early 1940s about how the U.S. would achieve global dominance after World War II.
Right, and that to me is it's profoundly
I have to go read that because
important.
I haven't read it, but it's fascinating.
Right, the studies are worth reading themselves, but the book by Shoup and Minter is a very good summary of it, called Imperial Brain Trust. And they did essentially map everything out. One volume written by Alan Dulles on security and sovereignty, if I remember correctly. That volume is still not declassified.
Wow.
Some people speculate that he may have called for the creation of what eventually becomes the Central Intelligence Agency. But
That's Alan Dulles.
Yeah, Alan Dulles wrote this. He was the person in charge of it. He was like the vice president of the council at the time. And then it's most famously pitched.
He was really the most extraordinary dark force, perhaps. He's quoted in something I just read. I don't know if you've come across it, supposedly saying in 1941 or 42, we're fighting on the wrong side in World War II. But very dark person.
Yes, absolutely. He made common cause with Nazis and such after the war and helped to rescue them, actually. That's one of the strangest facts of the U.S. Post-war era, is that they rehabilitate a lot of these Nazis and Japanese and Italian fascists, and they incorporate them in the new regime because essentially, I mean, remember that the Axis was the Anti-Communist International, the
Yep.
Anti-Comintern Pact. Like the U.S. basically picks up the mantle of the Anti-Comintern, the Anti-Communist International. They become the Anti-Communist International.
And today's German intelligence agency, the BND, was established by the U.S. with the leadership of one of the top Nazis, Gehlen. So it became a post-World War II Nazi-led organization as partner with the CIA.
Essentially, yes. And in Japan, the LDP is the one-party state of Japan, essentially. And they were founded with a slush fund of over $100 million worth of war loot that was stolen by a Yakuza drug trafficker who was made a rear admiral and was a Class A war criminal. The CIA sprang him from jail, and all of that money has fueled a one-party state, essentially. And they have these slush funds that over the years they're scandals, because how does the LDP have all this money? But it's like it goes back to war crimes, essentially. And so Japan is just not what we think. But it's like this whole American era is not what we think in general. And it's falling apart, and I don't think people understand why. And so that's what we're trying to explain.
So just to underscore, because I think you've got it beautifully, and I've been grappling with this, trying to find the right words and the way to describe it. The public state, so people understand that, is what we think we elect. We have an election coming up. We're going to elect a president. We think it's a big deal for foreign policy, but it's just the tip of the iceberg, if you want to put it that way, because then is the security state. That's the CIA, Pentagon, National Security Council, and all of the rest of the intelligence system, and all of the specialized Senate and House committees, armed services committees, and others that are part of this security state. And you talk about it operating with secrecy, expediency, and hierarchy, I think it is. But basically, that's the hard, permanent state of the administration to exercise American control as much as possible over the rest of the world. And then the deep state or the overworld, that's the drivers. The drivers are the business leaders, the wealth holders who say, we need to control that oil. We need to control those ports. We need to control these natural resources. We need to control this land. And they ultimately are, in a way, driving this desire or this underlying grand strategy, sometimes called for American domination to the extent possible. By the way, I've had the experience as all my career has been advising other governments, not the U.S., but developing countries, because my concern has been economic development. I've never taken a penny for it because I don't want any question about this. I work on my academic salary and don't take a penny from another government, and never have. But I've had the experience that I go to another country and the American ambassador says, come for a courtesy call. And then I'm given a lecture by the American ambassador about some American large company operating in that country. And the words are, please tell your friends X, Y, or Z about such and such company. Often a company that is later exposed as doing criminality and corruption and so on. But that's part of the job of the American ambassador. So that's how the overworld operates to influence the security apparatus, which includes our embassies abroad, certainly.
It does. And the other aspect of the deep state, I would say, that differentiates it from just the security bureaucracies is when in a pinch, they will create new institutions to make sure that they can win the day. So in the 70s, when after Watergate, there were all those intelligence investigations, and people like Helms and Bush and Shackley, they essentially create a CIA cobbled together from their networks of foreign intelligence agencies and corrupt banks and so on, that they're able to carry out essentially the CIA operations that the CIA isn't able to carry out because they keep having to testify in front of Congress and dealing with headlines in the New York Times and so on. So that's
the network of other intelligence agencies, or something else that you're referring to?
I think that, well, during Watergate, they would and under Stansfield Turner as well, under Jimmy Carter, where he fires a lot of people in the post-Watergate hearings, Church Committee era and so on. The CIA is unable to conduct business as usual, but these old boys, some of whom have been cast out, like Richard Helms, he's sent to Iran, but he works with the Shah, and he works with Saudi intelligence and other people, and he works with the guy who becomes the richest man in the world, Adnan Khashoggi, and they establish this thing called the Safari Club. But it was essentially just a network of spooks and so on who are able to carry out CIA covert operations, but not even really with the CIA. People suspect that this is part of the outfit responsible for the October surprise business in the 1980 election. But it's, that's speculative, but it sort of tracks with what these people are up to. So it's the control. It doesn't even have to be so much the CIA running everything. It's the power of the oligarchy to really set the narrative across all these institutions. I mean, look at how academia and the mainstream media
Yep.
all essentially reify and affirm the central mythology of the U.S. even, and this is where it's becoming kind of scary these days. There's this power that animates all of these institutions, and it makes them affirm ridiculous and basically discredited and untenable ideas of what the U.S. is and what U.S. foreign policy is. And it's this kind of inertia of organized money that has corrupted all of our institutions. I would say that's what animates the deep state, and it's the security state is more or less the way that they've bureaucratized, institutionalized their norms and preferences into a full-on regime.
Aaron, one thing that I try to understand, maybe you can give some insight into it. There's so many lies and false narratives with the Ukraine war, which I've been quite knowledgeable about for a lot of reasons, and watching Ukraine for more than 30 years. To my mind, NATO enlargement and all of the U.S. attempts to destabilize Russia around its periphery and so on have been the cause of the war. None of this is discussed by the mainstream media at all. You can't get 5 words in the New York Times that counter their favorite word, unprovoked. This is just Putin being an imperialist. It has nothing to do with the fact that the United States has been trying regime change in Russia, trying to surround Russia, trying to put missile bases around Russia, trying to expand NATO. They won't talk about any of that. And there are countless areas like that. Syria, which we've mentioned briefly, where Obama signed the order to the CIA to overthrow the government of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, in what is known as Operation Timber Sycamore. I think it was mentioned in the New York Times 3 times in a decade. You don't hear about it at all, other than in passing once. But I got to know about it in a number of ways, including from top international diplomats that were watching the U.S. keep the war going, and they were describing to me what was going on. Now, my question is, and we could add the Kennedy assassination and the Warren Commission cover-up and all the rest. It seems to me the American people don't believe anything that they're told, but the narratives persist, they're used, and maybe it's not even the goal of the narrative makers to try to convince the public of these things, because sometimes the stories are so stupid, so ridiculous. Well, it wasn't the U.S. that blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. It was 6 people in a sailboat. What is the point of this kind of repetition of nonsense that you wouldn't pass a high school essay paper, but it's repeated by our journal of record, the New York Times, repeatedly? Why do they do this? Why do they go along with this stuff?
Well, I think it's as America has shifted more and more to the right politically, in terms of just being a top-down empire run for the benefit of oligarchs, the policies become less and less defensible over time. The amount of lying was not so great in the 50s and 60s. People were shocked when Eisenhower said, came out after the U-2 incident, and
a U.S. spy plane was shot down, and Eisenhower said it was a weather a weather plane that had gone off course, and then the Soviet Union produced the pilot and the U-2 spy plane that it had shot down. So he was caught in a direct lie.
Right, and that was significant at the time. And it's not that they always told the truth about everything back then, but it was they didn't get caught in brazen lies that often. And this was something new. But as the policy gets more and more belligerent and really less defensible, and as information technology allows details to come out sooner, because Eisenhower had lied about events in Iran and Guatemala earlier in his presidency. It wasn't as if the government wasn't lying there, but here they get totally caught. Now it's every area of policy, in every area, significant area where there's some conflict with the U.S. You can expect most of what you hear to not be true, either lies of omission or outright lies, and it's overwhelming. It's a tapestry of lies. I think that's what, maybe it was Putin that called some of these American narratives that. But really, I mean, if you had to be a propagandist for a country, being a propagandist for China or Russia would be a pretty easy job, because you really mostly just have to try to accurately point out what the U.S. is doing. And the more you editorialize, you probably are hurting your cause. The U.S.'s policies are indefensible across the board in so many areas. You can't even keep track of them, and it's now coming to a point that we've united most of the world against us. And I think that this moment is sort of a passing of dominance, and the lying is so ever present. And the strategy, as you say, has not really been to mobilize the public behind a national mission anymore. I think after the 60s, they came to the conclusion that the public should just be managed and kind of atomized, and they wanted to get rid of the draft too. And so there's
take away any pressure points from the public, the draft being the real flashpoint, and then you could let the deep state and the overworld just go on and do its business. I mean, the security state and the deep state, to use your terminology, to go on and do its business.
And the ironic thing is that Biden, I think, may be most remembered decades from now as saying to those oligarchs, "Under me, nothing will fundamentally change." But because he was so slavishly devoted to the main drift of U.S. unipolarity, and was oblivious to where it was leading, I think everything is fundamentally changing. And so he was lying to them too.
So give us hope as we come to the closing minutes. The failures, to my mind, are pervasive, especially if we date it now in our talk, and just I think helpful for the listeners. Maybe the idea of U.S. exceptionalism goes back to the start of the U.S. The U.S. as overseas empire is after World War II. The neocon takeover, which is we're really going to run the world, is after 1991. And now we've been 30 years with this attempt by the deep state and the security state to run the show abroad. Many wars, perpetual wars, dangerous wars. Nothing seems to be working, and the American people don't like it. Is there some way out of this?
Well, if I'll say something let me say something grim and then also hopeful. If you go back to we were talking about the Council on Foreign Relations, Wall Street funded, and they just say the U.S. is going to try to rule the world after World War II, and their pitch man is Henry Luce, Time Life magazine, saying it was going to be an American century, and we're going to make lots of money too. And then he's argued against by the vice president at the time, Henry Wallace, who is really kind of an internationalist, who says we should try to run the world based on international cooperation, no empires, no master races, nothing like that. He is basically removed less violently than John Kennedy from the political system in 1944. And you get Harry Truman, and they go for empire. Well, the next internationalists to come along are people like Dag Hammarskjöld and JFK at that moment there in the early 60s. It seemed hopeful. And they both end up getting killed, and then people like the Kennedys get killed. And so you don't end up with kind of a more lawful internationalism prevailing as U.S. policy. And then H.W. Bush himself and Gorbachev, they were both sort of in different ways. And definitely H.W. Bush's internationalism had a more corporate capitalist flavor than Gorbachev, but both of them were more or less calling for different kinds of internationalism and cooperation, as opposed to this neocon policy that prevailed. But now I think that it's coming to it that the people like Wallace and JFK and Gorbachev, the internationalists seem to have history on their side, and this is a positive thing for humanity. but it could lead to great shocks for the U.S. The biggest threat of all, obviously, is nuclear war. Is the U.S. going to give up its empire, or is it going to fight to the bitter end and provoke some sort of nuclear exchange that ends human civilization, or at least the Northern Hemisphere? That's the pessimistic side. The optimistic side is that this should end. The U.S. is eventually getting to the point that it can't dictate outcomes anymore. All it can do is dictate narratives in a dictatorial way that is becoming obviously dictatorial and detached from reality. They're headed for a defeat in Ukraine that I think is going to be so monumental and catastrophic. It's even more catastrophic to the mystique of the U.S. empire. And I think that is fading. The mystique is fading. The ability to determine material outcomes in the world is fading. That is bad for the U.S. oligarchy, could cause problems for the U.S. population like myself, but is ultimately hopeful for humanity because the Chinese and Russians and other countries around the world are essentially calling for international law cooperation and adherence to international law. And the U.S. is the main force standing in the way of that. And it's pretty obviously the continuation and culmination of 5 centuries of Western imperialism as the dominant force of the world and a kind of commercial white supremacy over the world that is, I think, going to end. And that deserves to end because all empires end and all empires should end because imperialism should end and cooperation should reign to try to solve the problems that humanity faces.
We're going to end on that very hopeful note. I want to mention again that triumvirate that you mentioned, Henry Wallace, who was vice president of the United States under Roosevelt, who in response to the American century of Henry Luce, that grandiosity, called for the century of the common man instead. John F. Kennedy, who of course called for peace and gave the greatest speech on peace ever given, in my view, the American University Commencement Address on June 10, 1963. And Mikhail Gorbachev, who inspired me in trying to help the Soviet Union and Russia already more than 30 years ago and was absolutely the great statesman of peace. And Aaron, you've said that it's going to be Wallace, Kennedy, and Gorbachev that have their day now because they're on the right side. We're going to hold you to that. But let me say, this has been a wonderful discussion. We've been discussing American Exception, Empire in the Deep State by Aaron Good. It's a fantastic book, Aaron. Really a great contribution. Thank you so much for joining Book Club with Jeffrey Sachs, and wish everybody peace in the world and look forward to being with you on the next episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you. As I said in the intro, that discussion is an episode of Book Club with Jeffrey Sachs, which you can find at the website, bookclubwithjeffreysachs.org, and on all the major podcast apps and on YouTube. I recommend people follow them. The books are well chosen, and the discussions are great. I want to add a little more to further flesh out my theory of the deep state within the U.S. tripartite state and the scholarship upon which my work is based. FYI, there is an American Exception documentary film in the works, which should be finished relatively soon. Back in the 50s and 60s, the early years after the end of World War II, there was a real innocence about the American government and the American system. It really wasn't until the JFK assassination and then the Vietnam War and all the lies and suspicions around those events, and then the political assassinations of the 60s, which followed JFK's assassination, the JFK assassination, the Malcolm X assassination, the Martin Luther King assassination, the Robert F. Kennedy assassination, and then Watergate, that people began to have their eyes opened about the nature of the U.S. national security state and U.S. foreign policy, and they began to question certain Cold War orthodoxies that had been built up for many years. Now, Peter Dale Scott was a Canadian diplomat, and as a professor of English at the University of California at Berkeley, he became a radical based in part on his experiences with the diplomatic service and the way that they dealt with crises in Laos and so on. These give him kind of an insider perspective. And he did have a political science PhD, even though he was a poet and the son of a well-known poet in Canada. He is a political writer and historian and a theorist, really without peer in the U.S. So I would say that what Karl Marx is to historical materialism, Peter Dale Scott is to deep politics, which we'll explain here. But he first began by studying all the intrigues that were suppressed by the mainstream surrounding Vietnam and things like the drug trade and political assassinations, and found connections between all of these things. And so it led him to theorize about something he called parapolitics, which he defined as, in 1972, to give you a sense of how far ahead of his time he was, a system or practice of politics in which accountability is consciously diminished. And this was needed to, as an analytical construct, to address the fact that although we're taught about democracy and the rule of law and such, increasingly the secret government agencies were acting lawlessly in politically impactful ways around the world and in the U.S., and this was changing the nature of our system, and it needed to be understood because you were having this situation where a democracy is not really a democracy, that people don't know what the policies even are, or what is a policy, or what is a secret operation. It's just a completely undemocratic set of institutions that were doing these things. And so Peter Dale Scott wrote about this in The War Conspiracy, The Secret Road to the Second Indochina War, which through a number of shenanigans was not published until the last possible date that it could be published, thanks probably to the intervention of the CIA, but that's a whole different story. The point is that even by the early 70s, Peter Dale Scott was looking at these things. He was ahead of his time. By 1993, and this is shortly after the release of Oliver Stone's JFK, Peter Dale Scott revised in a book this idea of parapolitics, or the relevance of all of these secret operations and connections to organized crime, and he spoke of a deep political system, and it's one which habitually resorts to decision-making and enforcement procedures outside as well as inside those publicly sanctioned by law and society. So what he was saying here is that, yes, we do have the president and the joint chiefs and the attorney general and Congress and the courts and the police, and they do all these things that we know about. But we also have a way of the regime or the powers that be getting their way, powerful political actors who are able to get their way by resorting to political things outside of the legal system. That's things that are publicly sanctioned by law and society. And to write, this is really the earliest formulation, I would say, of the deep state, even though he didn't call it that. He called it the deep political system. And he was pointing to something very serious and systemic in our system, that it wasn't just democracy, that there was something else dark and imperialistic that could intervene at times to veto politics, more or less. He defined deep politics as all those political practices and arrangements, deliberate or not, that are usually repressed in public discourse rather than acknowledged. And he saw this as an improvement over the parapolitics framework, because the parapolitics issue was just essentially conspiratorial or clandestine governance or clandestine statecraft and or deep statecraft, or however you would call it, parapolitical statecraft. Things that were meant to be obscured, methods of governing and carrying out the affairs of state that are conspiratorial and secretive. But he realized that these are basically conspiracies, and he didn't really want to just be a theorist of conspiracies. He wanted to situate the conspiratorial and criminal activities and institutions that he had discovered within their actual political system. which he called a deep political system. And he called deep politics all of those things that just are not discussed about our regime, that are repressed rather than acknowledged by the mainstream commenters and politicians, political figures, etc. Now, the term deep state enters the lexicon globally in the aftermath of a 1966 incident at Susurluk in Turkey. And this was a very strange car crash in which a senior police official, I believe like perhaps the top official in the security apparatus, and a minister of parliament, the guy here with the mustache, and a former beauty queen were, they were in a car crash together with the head of the Grey Wolves, a terrorist. So this is from Wikipedia. According to an anonymous witness in the 2007 Ergenekon investigation, everyone initially survived the crash, which was precipitated by remotely disabling the brakes of the Mercedes. A 3-person team came and snapped the necks of the girlfriend and the Kately, the head of the Grey Wolves, the most wanted terrorist in the world, basically, at that point. But the Minister of Parliament, Bukak, was rescued by his guards, who also took his bag from the trunk and called one of the Grey Wolves onto the scene. One of the first people to visit the site was Mafia King Ali Yasak, better known as Dredge Ali, who took Kately, the dead Grey Wolf leader, took his bag from the car, according to Tonke Guni. So somebody else could go and look into who all of these individuals were, but that is the gist of it as I recall reading about it in different sources. Evidence seized at the crash site indicated that Kately, the Grey Wolf leader, had been carrying an international terrorist, diplomatic credentials given by Turkish authorities, a government-approved weapons permit, a fake passport in the name of Mehmet Ozbey, the same alias used by Mehmet El-Agca, the guy who shot the Pope years prior, numerous 911 Beretta, 9mm Beretta, and Saddam Beretta 92 pistols, one .22 caliber Beretta with a silencer, and 2 Heckler and Koch MP5 submachine guns. Also, 2 listening devices, a cache of narcotics, and thousands of US dollars. So this was something that could not be explained by conventional political frameworks. This was basically confirmation of probably a lot of what would have been called conspiracy theories. But interestingly, the name that they give to this kind of organization that could intervene in Turkish politics was Derin Devlet, which translates to the deep state. And one of the only people writing about these sort of associations for years, in the years leading up to this, was Peter Dale Scott. So I think that he really deserves the credit for inventing the deep state even before the term was invented by the Turkish. And he wrote more about Turkey, for example, in this great essay on parafascism that he wrote in the late 1970s. He was writing about all kinds of arrangements just like this one. So this really, Peter Dale Scott deserves the credit for this. Now, as far as Western academics writing about the deep state itself, the first one was a friend of mine and Peter Dale Scott's, Ola Tenander, in 2006, his article, Democratic State versus Deep State, Approaching the Dual State of the West. It appeared in this anthology, Government of the Shadows. And this is, he's talking about the deep state as this thing that marches alongside of the democratic state. Peter Dale Scott in 2007 had conferred with Ola Tenander and he wrote this book and got it published at the University of California. It's called The Road to 9/11, and he wrote about the deep state. So this is the first American author writing about it. And the way that he described it at the time, which he's sort of modified ever since then, but we can talk about this 2007 definition: a milieu both inside and outside government with the power to steer the history of the public state, which is like the democratic state, Congress, the president, and all that, and sometimes redirect it. In an endnote, he acknowledges that indeed there are also extragovernmental structural components in the deep state system. So by that, he meant that although some of these institutions like organized crime would be considered not part of the state, and some of these, the way that this power is exercised is sort of informally by powerful overworld figures. That's his term for the oligarchs, essentially. There are at times actual organizations that we would have to see as part of a deep state. In American War Machine, which Peter wrote in 2010, he described a particular deep state enterprise, which in this case, the Adnan Khashoggi BCCI Safari Club milieu of the late 70s is when this emerged. He described this as part of a supranational deep state whose organic links to the CIA may have helped consolidate it. It is clear, however, that decisions taken at this level by the Safari Club and BCCI were in no way guided by the political determinations of those elected to power in Washington, and were instead expressly created to overcome restraints established by political decisions in Washington. So here he's talking about a kind of ad hoc deep state organization that emerged. I mentioned this in the interview with Jeffrey Sachs, that when the CIA was being investigated by Congress in the late 70s, the oligarchs and their legmen in the bureaucracy and in different government insiders, people like Richard Helms, they essentially said, well, let's just make our own CIA so that we can do all of these deep state activities, even without having to rely on any sanction from the government. So this is a clear example of something that is absolutely not explained in the Constitution or in civics textbooks, but it was a part of the U.S. regime, which is an empire. In 2013, the New York Times put the deep state into mainstream discussion by having an article on all the new words of 2013. And they asserted that deep state was an important new term and defined it as a hard-to-perceive level of government or super control that exists regardless of elections and that may thwart popular movements or radical change. Some have said that Egypt is being manipulated by its deep state. And although I am no fan of the New York Times, for obvious reasons, this is a passable definition, I would say. In 2016, Mike Lofgren, who's a former Republican congressional aide, wrote this book called The Deep State after he appeared on Bill Moyer's show on PBS talking about it. And he defined this as a hybrid association of key elements of government and parts of top-level finance and industry that is effectively able to govern the United States with only limited reference to the consent of the governed as normally expressed through elections. Again, this isn't a bad definition, but of course this is in 2016, which is around when a certain mercurial and unpredictable, volatile leader of the United States, a politician, began using the term the deep state, and it sort of takes on a strange life of its own. And people like Alex Jones had used it as well, and it sort of delegitimizes and decontextualizes and de-scholarizes, if we want to say that, the idea of the deep state. It just takes it as this dumb kind of Illuminati thing. It's more like a MacGuffin or something at this point with these people. It seems it's not this system of oligarchic control that allows capitalist oligarchs to stay on top no matter what. It's according to the right-wing conspiracist point of view, it's more a collection of Illuminati type figures that are like standing in the way of all the good capitalists and real Americans, etc., etc. But Mike Lofgren did take this to a bigger audience to make the term, along with Bill Moyers, make it visible enough to be worth apparently defiling by President Trump. In American Exception, Empire, and the Deep State, I have a glossary where I define deep state, and part of this definition I list here. Misappropriated in the Trump era, the term herein refers to the various institutions that collectively exercise undemocratic power over state and society. Pluralistic to varying degrees, the deep state is an outgrowth of the overworld of private wealth. It includes most notably the institutions that advance overworld interests through the nexuses connecting the overworld, the underworld, that's organized crime, and the national security organizations that mediate between them. So as Jeffrey Sachs and I discussed, the overworld, which is really Peter Dale Scott's term, and it works. This is essentially the milieu of oligarchs, oligarchs of corporate wealth. And the underworld is, of course, organized crime. And yes, national security organizations do mediate between these forces routinely. That's sort of their purpose, one could argue. Now, in defining the deep state as part of a tripartite state, I want to have a diagram here and show this that I think makes it clear. But we grow up in America and we think of the public state. Okay, that's one part of the tripartite state. This is democracy, Congress, state governments, local governments, the Supreme Court, et cetera, et cetera. This is the part that we talk about in school and that politicians and newscasters pretend is basically, the main important part. Now, after World War II, and even before World War II, there was a kind of military and security state. But after World War II, and with the U.S. decision to go for global empire, there's the creation of a national security state, especially with the 1947 National Security Act. This is the Pentagon, FBI, CIA, now it's Homeland Security, National Security Agency, all these local police agencies and so on. And these are, they operate more on the basis of secrecy and top-down power hierarchy in comparison to Congress, which is supposed to be, and the rest of democracy, it's supposed to be open, transparent, and lawful. During the Cold War, it was established that sometimes these agencies would have to act in secrecy, and they would have to, do legally questionable things in order to protect us from the global communist conspiracy. And we're not to know what those things are because it would be dangerous for national security if we knew, of course, so they have to keep it from us. Okay, so that's, in a way, this could be argued as a kind of a dual state, a national security state and a democratic state. However, I believe that this misses the bigger story of this regime, because really any regime could be said to have a visible government and then a security state. And so you could say that any government has a dual state. It doesn't really describe the kind of regime that we have or explain much of it. The real issue is the deep state, which we could think of as essentially the oligarchic state. It is really what it comes down to. It's all of those institutions that allow for top-down rule in a nominal democracy, top-down governance. And so I put it here on this to sort of signify that it's more overlap than separate spheres. Like, it's not as if you have a clean break between the democratic state and the security bureaucracies and then these deep political forces. So the deep state, oligarchic power, it dominates the public state, most obviously by the sheer amount of campaign contributions, but also because it owns the media. The oligarchs own the media that reports on politics. Every year when they spend all this money on advertising, it's basically like the oligarch class gives money to oligarch-owned media outlets to determine who's going to be the next set of political leaders, which, if you think about it, is really absurd, because they pay for these ads with political contributions from oligarchs, as I said, and then they give the money back to these oligarchs with enormous ad buys for this time of year, every election year. It really is like a self-licking ice cream cone, and the effect it produces is oligarchic top-down governance on behalf of an oligarchy of wealth, year after year after year. And in terms of the national security state, it was these Wall Street connected forces that essentially decided that we would go for World War II or for hegemony over the world after World War II. So that would necessitate the creation of this new giant bureaucracy in the military and security services. Specifically, they wanted the CIA to be created, and its earliest covert operations were really done on behalf of corporate interests, oil interests, the United Fruit Company, and so on. they were taken out. They were first discussed at places like the Council on Foreign Relations, for example, like the coups in the 1950s operations, which overthrew the democratically elected governments of Iran and Guatemala, were first discussed at the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the Wall Street think tank, this oligarch think tank, basically. And the oligarchy, of course, funds think tanks, funds all sorts of civil society groups. It really dominates American politics this way. Now, some could argue, like, well, that's not really a part of the state to say this, but it's actually, the ruling class, and you don't need to think of it as a deep state. However, I would argue with that by saying that there are times when, as with the Safari Club in the late 70s, where these forces can actually create governing institutions with no state sanction whatsoever. That was a remarkable thing, and it was really illustrative. Additionally, you have cases like the JFK assassination and the Nixon assassination, or the Nixon, removal by Watergate, wherein the regime and parts of it that we don't see are able to intervene and override democracy. And this is not purely the work of people in bureaucracies. This involves the people who control civil society and media outlets and so on, or else they wouldn't be able to get away with it, obviously. And so this is a part of the deep political power. Oligarchic power is very much in the national security state. Furthermore, there are institutions that have been created by different acts of political figures or Congress or military officials that are so secretive and top-down and anti-democratic that they would have to be considered part of the deep state, I would argue. In particular, the Doomsday Network, or the Continuity of Government Network, which is supposed to assert overriding powers in the event of a national emergency, especially a nuclear attack. These networks have enormous power, and they have been active on days like the day that Kennedy was killed and on 9/11, and they were used in Iran-Contra crimes. Networks connected to the Doomsday Network, communications networks, were used during Iran-Contra. So they keep coming up in these big controversial conspiratorial events in U.S. history. And in particular, in the 1950s, this board of wise men that was supposed to essentially be called as sort of a council of oligarchs in the event of a national emergency, many of them were not even in government. They were essentially oligarchs. They were in the private sector, and yet they were given this power to act in a way that would override the Constitution in an emergency, and who even knows who is allowed to declare that there is such an emergency. So this is an example of the deep state, of a deep state organization and entity that we have to think of as superseding or transcending the national security state as we understand it, or the democratic state. Now, in a bigger sense, I don't clarify this as much in the book, but I'll go ahead and use more political science terminology here to be more specific. But I will speak of the deep state in a systemic sense. And here we have, like, not just the democratic state with Congress and all that, and the national security state, but we also have civil society. And this is this is there to illustrate how the regime of a country is not just the government, but it's all of those institutions and actors that determine who is going to have access to the state, who control of the state, who is going to be sovereign in the state. And so civil society is important here. However, here again, with civil society, we have deep political power. It neutralizes, which is oligarchic power, which is capitalism, you could say. It neutralizes the ability of civil society institutions to act as a check against top-down anti-democratic forces. And so here it is, again, the diagram to show what this is. Over all of this, and bleeding into these different areas and really casting a shadow over everything, is money, organized money, and that is what oligarchy in an advanced capitalist system is all about. And civil society groups in the U.S. have to depend on money. So, independent media or charities or foundations, these are all, even mega churches, different groups are funded by deep political power. And sometimes they do very strange things, like right-wing, one of the richest men in America, H.L. Hunt, who was also apparently supporting the Nation of Islam back in the day. Why would he be manipulating civil society like that? We could speculate, but that's for probably a different discussion. The point is, capitalism, corporate power, deep political power, oligarchic power, this dominates the national security state, the democratic state, and our supposed civil society, liberal, free civil society. Please do subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon for the best coverage and analysis of the deep politics of the U.S. empire. Our new series on the Lansky Syndicate, CIA, Mossad threads running through the JFK assassination, Watergate, and beyond. It's out now. This is, to my mind, amazing material that I really wanted to release as a book, but one, I'm too busy with the podcast, and two, I feel that the material is so important and relevant that I wanted to get it out there as soon as possible. So if you are able, please subscribe at patreon.com/American Exception. There's a link in the show notes. Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. I especially want to thank Professor Jeffrey Sachs and his excellent team at Book Club with Jeffrey Sachs. It is so heartening to find him in agreement with my critique of the U.S. regime. I was very much gratified when on a recent podcast appearance, Professor Sachs was asked about the real nature of the U.S. regime, and he proceeded to cite and summarize American Exception, Empire in the Deep State. It was my hope that as the U.S. empire continued to collapse, more and more people would come to see that it is essentially, as I have argued and documented, a covertly and increasingly overtly lawless empire maintained for the express purpose of global dominance on behalf of an oligarchy of corporate wealth. Let's hope that Professor Sachs is merely ahead of his peers and that more and more Western intellectuals will take up this cause, which is really the cause of the global majority, humanity, basically. And that is to reorganize the world on the basis of lawful international cooperation rather than lawless imperial domination. In short, we must move beyond playing endlessly vicious games on the devil's chessboard.